She stood under the orange glow of the porch light, hands on her hips, and loudly declared to the mayor, "Welcome to my 12-year Halloween tradition." I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. I simply folded my hands over my coat, leaned against the wooden railing and watched. What would you do if your own sister stole everything you built and announced it as hers in front of the entire town? This isn't just a Halloween story, it's a betrayal you won't forget. The air that night was sharp, the kind that stung your lungs when you breathed in too quickly. It was 6:47 p.m. just before the official ribbon cutting. The sun had already dipped below the row of maples across the street, leaving long shadows stretching over the lawn. Pumpkins flickered. Kids in costumes rustled past in groups. And there she was, my sister, standing in front of my haunted house like a queen addressing her court. I built that house with my own 2 hands. Every fog machine, every flickering bulb, every plywood wall, funded and crafted by me. I'd spent months designing the maze layout, running wires through crawl spaces, balancing on ladders in the heat of July while she sent can't-make-it texts. Now she was standing center stage, waving at the cameras as if I didn't exist. "Isn't it incredible?" she gushed, gesturing toward the towering skeleton archway I'd built last fall. 12 years we've been doing this. A real family tradition. A small, controlled smile curved across my lips. I didn't correct her. That was the first thing nobody expected, my silence. She took my stillness for surrender. But in truth, every time she opened her mouth, she was sealing her own fate. I glanced around the yard like I was just another guest. The mayor's assistant was lining up reporters for their quick photo segment. A local news crew had parked a van near the sidewalk, cables running across the grass. The smell of burnt caramel from the food stand mixed with the damp chill of October. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, pointing excitedly toward the haunted house entrance. A warped wooden door with a motion-triggered creak I'd programmed myself. Everything looked perfect from the outside. But I knew what she didn't. Several critical elements of the house required a password only I had. She could pretend all she wanted, but the control panel inside the tool shed would never respond to her. I kept my expression soft as if proud of her. Inside my heartbeat was steady, too steady. That calm comes only when you've already set the trap and all that's left is to watch it close. As she led the mayor down the gravel path toward the archway, I followed at a measured pace, staying just out of frame of the cameras. I overheard her repeating little rehearsed lines, claiming credit for my vision, my hard work, my creativity. She had practiced this speech. She had waited for this spotlight. A small part of me wanted to call her out right then, to step forward, tell the truth, wipe that smug smile off her face. But no. Public arguments only make noise. I preferred silence. Sharp, surgical silence that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. My neighbor Margaret leaned toward me and whispered, "I didn't know this was her project." "I thought you." I placed a gentle finger over my lips. "Shoo," I said, not taking my eyes off my sister. "Let her have her moment." The mayor raised a pair of oversized scissors, ready to cut the ribbon. Flashbulbs popped. My sister's grin widened. She looked untouchable. But I noticed something nobody else did. A tiny shiver in her hands as she adjusted the microphone. She wasn't nervous about the crowd. She was nervous about the house itself. She hadn't been inside since last year, and this time she wasn't the one in control. The ribbon fluttered to the ground. Applause filled the yard. She led the mayor toward the entrance, reporters trailing behind like ducks. I hung back by the porch, pretending to sip cider from a paper cup. From that distance I could see the faint glow of the control box through the shed window. A red light blinking steadily, locked behind a 4-digit code. Only I knew it. That blinking light was my secret advantage. It wasn't just about the haunted house. It was about years of being dismissed, ignored, told I was too intense, too particular, too old to bother with projects like this. She had called me obsessive when I drew up blueprints at the kitchen table. She had rolled her eyes when I bought fog machines with my savings. And now she wanted to harvest the applause while I disappeared into the background. Not this time. I walked slowly toward the crowd gathered near the entrance. The damp grass softened my footsteps. From where I stood, I could hear her voice echoing through the cheap speakers we'd installed along the path. She was giving interviews now, boasting about the years of dedication it took to make this event so special. "Years," she said. She hadn't lifted a hammer. Margaret approached again, lowering her voice. Why are you letting her say all this? I turned to her with a calm expression. Because she's saying it on record, I replied. Margaret frowned, confused. I didn't elaborate. The truth was, this wasn't the first time my sister had claimed credit for something I built. But it was the first time I had evidence, leverage, and timing on my side. She thought tonight was her victory. She didn't realize it was the opening scene of her downfall. A sudden gust of wind rattled the dry corn stalks lining the pathway, making the decorations creak like bones. I caught a whiff of damp earth and wood glue, the kind of scent you never forget after weeks of building in the summer heat. That smell anchored me. It reminded me of every late night I'd spent hammering panels while she slept inside with the air conditioner running. The mayor stepped through the door first, laughing nervously at the creaking sound. Reporters followed. My sister hesitated for a split second, probably remembering she didn't actually know where the breaker switches were, then plastered on a grin and followed. I stayed outside, positioning myself near the shed. I could see everything through the narrow gap in the fence. She thought she was in control because she held the microphone. But the real power was behind that shed door. Then came the first small crack. Not literal, emotional. She tried to start the fog sequence for the big entrance effect. But nothing happened. She pressed the remote again. Still nothing. I took a slow sip of cider, keeping my face neutral. The blinking red light inside the shed never stopped. One of the reporters asked, "Is this part of the show?" She laughed nervously. Yes. Just building suspense. The mayor looked mildly confused but polite. The crowd tittered, waiting for something to happen. And in that tiny silent pause, I felt the shift. She didn't have control anymore. I did. She caught sight of me standing by the fence. For a heartbeat, our eyes locked. Hers were wide, just for a second, like she'd realized I wasn't simply a bystander. I tilted my head slightly. Not a smile. Not a glare. Just a look that said, "Go on. Keep going." Her jaw tightened. She turned back to the cameras and started improvising excuses, her voice just a bit too high-pitched to sound natural. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I wanted her to feel that creeping panic, the kind that builds slowly when you're trapped by your own lies. As the crowd shifted restlessly, my mother appeared beside me. "Why are you just standing here?" she hissed. "Go help her." I turned my head slowly, meeting her gaze. "She said this was her event," I replied evenly. "She should manage it." My mother glared the same way she had when I was 10 and refused to share my art project. Some things never change. She had always favored my sister's flair over my quiet work. Tonight, though, the rules were different. The crowd started to thin slightly as the delay stretched. Kids grew restless. A reporter muttered something about losing light. My sister rushed toward the shed, flustered, pulling on the locked door. She knocked once hard. "Where's the key?" she whispered harshly. I raised my cup toward her from across the yard, as if toasting her performance. She froze, realization dawning. For the first time that evening, she didn't have a line ready. And that was exactly where I wanted her. Smiling in front of cameras, tangled in her own performance with no way out but through me. I didn't give it to her. Not yet. For the first time that evening, she didn't have a line ready. Her hands tightened around the shed door handle as if sheer force could undo months of what I had quietly built. I lifted my paper cup in her direction like a toast, steady, deliberate, then turned away, letting the weight of silence press down on her. I didn't need to confront her there. Not yet. I had something far more powerful than public yelling. A folder of signed, time-stamped documents sitting in my desk drawer. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was angry, anger had passed months ago, but because quiet satisfaction has a way of keeping you awake. I replayed the evening over and over, each scene sharper in my mind than the last. Her smug smile, the reporters, the fog machines that never started. She had looked so sure of herself, and I had let her walk straight into the performance she scripted. By 3 a.m. the neighborhood was silent. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe, a cup of decaf cooling in my hands. The house smelled faintly of sawdust. Some of it still clung to my clothes from the work earlier in the week. I pulled the manila folder toward me and opened it again slowly, like rereading a favorite chapter. Inside were copies of the business license, the city permits, and the trademark registration. All issued in my name. I traced my finger over the stamped dates. Each signature had felt like a quiet victory when I'd done it. Now together they formed an iron wall. It had started back in late August when she skipped yet another planning meeting. I'd been sitting in the clerk's office downtown, a small building that smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. While she spent her evenings rehearsing lines for some Halloween pageant, I was at a metal desk with a stack of forms, asking questions no one else thought to ask. How does one register a seasonal attraction as a business? What licenses were needed? How does trademarking work for event names? The clerk, a gray-haired woman named Diane, leaned over the counter and whispered, "Honestly, no one's ever gone through this much trouble for a haunted house. But good for you." I remember smiling at that. Not because it was funny but because Diane didn't know how personal this was. It wasn't trouble. It was preparation. When I signed that first paper I didn't think of it as revenge. I thought of it as insurance. But insurance has a way of becoming ammunition when betrayal arrives. In September I visited City Hall 3 times. The security guard started recognizing me by my brown corduroy jacket. "Back again, miss," he'd say. "Just finishing what I started," I'd reply. I sat in waiting rooms, filled out forms, spoke with inspectors and filed everything with quiet determination. There was no fanfare, no witnesses. I never mentioned it to my sister. Why would I? She barely noticed anything that didn't involve applause. One afternoon, while she was posting Halloween decoration ideas on social media, I met with a young man in the licensing department. He wore round glasses that kept sliding down his nose. "You'll want to get this notarized too," he said, tapping a section of the document. "It'll make things cleaner legally if someone tries to claim ownership later." I remember pausing on the phrase "claim ownership later." My fingers tightened on the pen. "Someone might," I said quietly. "And I want no room for confusion." He nodded, unaware of the entire family storm brewing behind those simple words. Back in the present, as dawn crept in through the kitchen blinds, the manila folder lay open in front of me like a loaded deck of cards. I gently slid the documents back inside, tapped the edges square and closed it with a soft thud. That sound, paper on wood, felt final. The next step wasn't confrontation. It was patience. I needed to let her build the illusion higher so that when the fall came it wouldn't be a stumble, it would be a collapse. The morning after the event, my sister showed up at my doorstep. She didn't knock like a guest, she pushed the door open like she owned the place. She still wore last night's makeup, now smudged around the edges, and carried the shed key in her hand. "What was that last night?" she demanded, voice sharp. I didn't answer immediately. I poured myself another cup of coffee, taking my time. The clink of the spoon against the mug echoed in the quiet kitchen. "I could ask you the same," I finally said, turning toward her. Her jaw tightened. "You embarrassed me." I set the mug down carefully. "No," I said evenly. "You embarrassed yourself." I simply didn't interrupt. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then crossed her arms. "The mayor was there. The press was there. Do you have any idea how that looked?" "Yes," I said softly. "Perfect." She stared at me, confused. For a moment I saw a flicker of something behind her anger, uncertainty. She didn't know what I had planned. That was exactly how I wanted it. "I'll fix it," she said finally, as if she were the director of some grand performance. "We'll reschedule. I'll just reset everything." I almost laughed. Reset everything. I leaned against the counter, folding my arms. "You can't reset what you don't own," I murmured. "What?" she snapped. "Nothing," I said lightly. "You'll see." Her eyes narrowed. She sensed something but couldn't quite grasp it. She grabbed the shed key, muttered something under her breath, and stormed out. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, I allowed myself a small, private smile. A few days later, I walked into the county recorder's office to collect the final piece, the official stamped copy of my business registration. It was heavier than I expected, embossed with the county seal. As I slid it into my folder, the receptionist said, "Congratulations, ma'am. You're the legal owner of the Hollow Haunt." "Yes," I replied. "Every last nail." She laughed, not realizing I meant it literally. By mid-October, her bragging had reached new heights. She started giving interviews to a local podcast, calling it her family legacy. Every time someone sent me a link, I listened with quiet amusement. Each lie was a thread she pulled tighter around herself. She invited sponsors. She booked a food truck. She even ordered banners with her name in cursive across the top. The Hollow Haunt, presented by Amanda. Presented by Amanda. The nerve. But I didn't call the printer. I didn't stop the deliveries. I just kept my documents safe and my voice steady. The louder she got, the more dangerous her position became. And she had no idea. I kept my preparations invisible. When inspectors came for final checks, they spoke to me, not her. When emails arrived about safety compliance, they came to my inbox. She assumed everything was running on autopilot. She never asked why I always carried a brown leather folder to every meeting. She never once looked at the paperwork. She lived in the performance. I lived in the details. And details decide who wins in the end. One evening, about a week before the planned event, my mother called. "Why are you spending so much time downtown lately?" she asked. "Just making sure everything is in order," I replied. She sighed. "Your sister's working so hard on this. I hope you're supporting her." I looked out the kitchen window at the haunted house frame silhouetted against the fading sky. "Oh," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I'm supporting her. More than she knows." She didn't hear the double meaning. He never did. By the time the night of betrayal came, the one with the mayor, the reporters, the blinking red light, I had already laid every brick of the legal foundation. Quietly. Methodically. No grand speeches. No dramatic threats. Just signatures. Dates. Seals. And those signatures would soon speak louder than any microphone she could grab. I slid the folder back into the drawer and locked it. The key felt warm in my palm, as if it held its own heartbeat. Outside, the morning light spilled across the lawn, catching the edges of the haunted house. She thought she had time to recover. She thought she could reset. She had no idea the consequences were already written down in black ink. That morning I woke up before my alarm, the October air crisp against my skin. Light crept in through the kitchen blinds, casting pale stripes across the folder still sitting on the counter. I didn't need to reread the documents. I'd memorized every page weeks ago. Instead, I ran my fingers along the folder's edge like someone tracing the handle of a blade they forged themselves. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the wood floors as they adjusted to the morning chill. Today wasn't a day for planning. It was the day the plan would breathe on its own. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed nonstop with notifications. She had sent out a last-minute press reminder, boasting about a surprise feature at that evening's haunted house event. I stared at the message, half amused, half in awe of her ability to overreach. She still believed she had control. I replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. Nothing else. She hated when I did that, when I gave her nothing to push against. She needed friction to perform. Silence was a language she couldn't speak. The house buzzed with quiet activity as I prepared for the day. I made a pot of coffee, laid out my brown corduroy jacket, and slipped the folder into my large canvas tote. I didn't need to bring it, technically. Everything was already filed. But holding it gave me a certain calm, like carrying an umbrella on a day that only threatens rain. Around noon, Margaret came by, holding a Tupperware of her famous apple bars. She stood at my doorway, squinting. "Big day again, huh?" I smiled. "Something like that." She handed me the container. "I've lived next to you for 20 years. I know that smile. What are you up to?" I shook my head gently. "Just letting things fall into place." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Margaret had seen enough family drama on this street to know when to stay quiet. By the time the sun began its slow descent, a thin layer of mist rolled in from the nearby creek. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and distant bonfires. I wrapped my scarf around my neck and headed toward the haunted house, folder tucked securely inside my bag. As I turned onto the street, I could already see the commotion ahead. Camera crews unloading tripods, reporters checking their lighting, kids in costumes waiting with eager eyes. She had outdone herself with the hype. A massive banner hung across the front fence, her name in looping gold letters, like she'd discovered the house herself. I stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, taking it in. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I felt something steadier, quieter. Like a tide pulling back before the wave hits. She spotted me before I reached the porch. "You're late," she snapped, striding toward me in her black coat, hair perfectly curled. "I'm on time," I said. "You're early." She brushed off my reply, eyes darting toward the growing crowd. "Just don't get in the way tonight, eh?" I've got this. The confidence in her voice would have been convincing if I didn't know what was coming. I won't get in the way, I said softly. Promise. She didn't hear the edge under my calm. He never did. The mayor arrived first, shaking hands with her at the gate. A local news anchor adjusted her microphone. Photographers began snapping shots of the banner, the archway, the families gathering at the entrance. Everything looked polished from the outside, as if the house itself had rehearsed for this day. I positioned myself near the shed again, the same spot as before. It gave me a perfect vantage point, close enough to see everything, far enough to remain invisible. The hum of generators filled the air, blending with the chatter of children and the occasional call of a crow overhead. The air grew colder as the sun dipped fully behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. Then, right on schedule, the courier arrived. He was a thin man in a navy jacket, carrying a thick envelope. He glanced at a clipboard, then at my sister. Delivery for Amanda. She blinked, thrown off. For me. He handed it over with a polite smile. Time sensitive. The cameras caught everything. The envelope, her confused expression, the crowd's sudden hush. She ripped it open without thinking, expecting some sponsor paperwork or an itinerary. Instead, she pulled out the legal notice, and I saw her face change in real time, from smug to uncertain, uncertain to pale. The cease and desist was short, clear, and brutally official. The mayor leaned in. Is everything all right? She stammered. It's nothing. A mix-up. Her voice cracked on the last word. The courier, bless him, didn't leave. He pointed to the signature line at the bottom. It's already filed. Just delivering your copy. Reporters, sensing blood in the water, zoomed in. Microphones angled forward. I stood still. I didn't need to say a word. Within minutes, the sheriff's car pulled up, lights quietly flashing blue in the dusk. He wasn't there to arrest anyone, just to enforce the order. He walked straight past the crowd and up to the mayor. They spoke in low tones, then turned toward her. Ma'am, the sheriff said gently, you're going to have to clear the property. This event isn't authorized under your name. She laughed nervously, a brittle sound. Of course it is. This is my event. He held up the papers. No, ma'am. It's not. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd murmured. Kids stopped tugging at their parents' hands. Even the fog machine hissed like it was holding its breath. I watched from my spot by the shed, heart pounding not from nerves, but from the surreal clarity of the moment. Months of quiet labor were crystallizing into this single scene. She looked around wildly, searching for someone to back her up. Her eyes finally landed on me. For a heartbeat, we stared at each other. She must have seen it then, the calm on my face, the absence of surprise. This was you, she whispered, voice trembling. I tilted my head slightly. I warned you once, I said softly. In my own way. She had no memory of that quiet comment weeks earlier in the licensing office waiting room, because she'd never been there. The mayor stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. Do we need to reschedule? The sheriff shook his head. This property isn't cleared for her to host anything. Legally, the event can't proceed. Cameras clicked like a flurry of small explosions. Reporters shouted questions. She tried to compose herself, but the cracks were too wide now. There's been a mistake, she shouted. This is my family's tradition. Everyone knows that. And then, like a slow-turning spotlight, the attention shifted to me. A reporter, a young woman with sharp eyes, approached me. Ma'am, are you involved with this event? I met her gaze steadily. Yes. I built it. Are you the legal owner? She asked. I simply nodded. The murmurs grew louder. The cameraman zoomed in. My sister's face drained of color. It wasn't the kind of exposure she liked. The sheriff gestured for everyone to clear the property. Guests began to shuffle away, confused and whispering. Kids clutched half-eaten caramel apples. Parents checked their watches. The food truck shut off its griddle. I stood by the fence, watching as her stage, her carefully curated illusion, collapsed piece by piece. She ran toward me, lowering her voice to a desperate hiss. You could have stopped this. I met her eyes. I didn't start it, I said calmly. You did. She shook her head, lips trembling, but no words came out. As the crowd dispersed, the reporters lingered. One of them, holding a boom mic, asked me if I'd give a short statement. I declined. The paperwork speaks for itself, I said. Because it did. I turned and walked slowly down the gravel path, my scarf tugged gently by the evening breeze. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, stripped of her spotlight. She'd built her performance on borrowed ground. Today that ground vanished beneath her feet. I stood at the end of the gravel path, the cool night pressing against my cheeks as the sheriff's car idled quietly behind me. The reporters were packing up, their voices fading into the chill like distant static. Families had already scattered, confused children trailing half-eaten caramel apples and plastic pumpkins. The house stood silent. No lights, no fog, no laughter, just the faint creak of a loose board in the porch swing. I took one last look before turning toward home. There was nothing left to say that night. But there was something left to do. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window in harsh rectangles, illuminating every scratch on the table. I sat with my coffee, hands wrapped around the mug, replaying her face when the sheriff read the cease and desist. Confusion. And underneath it all, fear. That image stayed with me like a photograph burned into memory. Not because I enjoyed it but because it marked a shift. For the first time in years she couldn't talk her way out of what she'd done. Words were her shield, paper was mine. And my paper was ironclad. By late morning my phone began to buzz. First came a text from her. "We need to talk. ASAP." I didn't reply. Then a call. I watched it ring until it stopped. She called again. And again. By the fifth call I silenced the phone and slid it face down on the table. She was good at immediate damage control. Dramatic apologies, public excuses, emotional pivots. But this wasn't a stage. This was paperwork. And paperwork doesn't care about tears. Around noon I pulled the brown folder toward me, flipping it open with steady fingers. I laid out the receipts, the itemized lists, the invoices I'd kept tucked away. Every fog machine, every light fixture, every gallon of black paint. The lumber from the hardware store. The wiring. The props. Even the extension cords had receipts. I wasn't just meticulous, I was prepared. I'd always kept good records even when people laughed at my labeled envelopes and neat files. "You treat Halloween like a business," she once teased. She had no idea how right she was. As I arranged the papers on the table, a quiet determination settled over me. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. This was about value, my value being seen, accounted for and paid. Margaret knocked on the back door just as I started typing the invoice on my laptop. She peeked in with a cautious smile. "Morning. How's the queen of the haunted house?" I laughed softly. "Retired maybe. Or promoted. Haven't decided yet." She stepped in, setting down another container of apple bars. "I saw the news last night. My husband replayed it twice. You didn't say a word and she crumbled on her own." I shrugged. Words were never my weapon. Margaret leaned over the table, spotting the stack of receipts. "Oh," she said, eyebrows lifting. "You're not done, are you?" I met her gaze. "Not yet." She gave a knowing nod. "Good." By afternoon the invoice was finished. Total, $24,000 exactly, down to the cent. I printed it on crisp white paper, sliding it into a cream-colored envelope. On the front, in neat handwriting, I wrote her name. It looked almost elegant. Deceptively gentle. Inside it was a storm. Along with the invoice I enclosed a formal letter from my attorney. Nothing aggressive, just factual. It explained the basis of ownership, the documented expenses, and a request for full reimbursement within 30 days. Simple. Professional. Unmistakable. She arrived at my house unannounced an hour later. Her car door slammed hard enough to rattle the porch railing. She marched up the steps in a wool coat, sunglasses still on despite the overcast sky. "You've made your point," she said sharply the moment I opened the door. I stepped aside. "Come in." She hesitated, then crossed the threshold. The living room smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. My dog barked once from the hallway, then went quiet. She removed her sunglasses slowly, like someone peeling away armor. "You didn't have to humiliate me," she said. I tilted my head. "I didn't humiliate you. You claimed something that wasn't yours. The consequences handled the rest." Her jaw clenched. "You could have stopped it." I handed her the envelope. "This isn't about stopping anything anymore." She opened it cautiously, pulling out the invoice. As her eyes moved down the list, her face shifted, not theatrical this time but genuinely unsettled. You're charging me, she said, voice rising. I'm billing you, I corrected evenly. For everything you used. Without permission. This is family, she snapped. You don't send your sister a bill. I held her gaze. Family doesn't steal from family either. For a moment, the house fell completely silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. She stared at the papers like they were written in a language she didn't understand, and in a way they were. She'd spent her life fluent in charm and improvisation. Legal language was foreign territory. She tried to switch tactics. I panicked, okay? I thought I could pull it off. It got out of hand. We can work this out. I leaned back against the counter. We are working it out. On paper. She tossed the invoice onto the coffee table like it burned her fingers. You're unbelievable. I know, I said softly. For once I am. After she left, slamming the door behind her, I exhaled slowly. My hands were trembling not from fear but from the weight of finally standing my ground. I'd spent years smoothing over her messes, avoiding confrontations, taking the quiet route. This was still quiet, but it had teeth. 2 days passed. No reply. No payment. Just silence. Then on the third morning a letter arrived. Her handwriting. Thick paper. I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a short note. You've made things impossible between us. I hope you're happy. No check. No offer. Just blame wrapped in self-pity. I folded the note once and placed it beside the invoice copy in my file. She wasn't used to silence she couldn't control. This was new territory for both of us. Meanwhile, the town buzzed quietly. The story had spread. People who once blindly believed her version were starting to ask questions. Margaret told me someone at the grocery store mentioned the sheriff's visit like it was the highlight of their week. The narrative was changing, not because I shouted louder but because the truth had weight. And that weight was starting to settle on her shoulders, not mine. One evening my mother called. I almost didn't pick up, but guilt got the better of me. I just talked to your sister, she began without preamble. She's devastated. I took a breath. She's not devastated. She's cornered. You've proven your point. Why keep pushing with this bill? Because it's not a point, I said, my voice low. It's accountability. She's family, my mother insisted. And so am I replied. The silence on the other end stretched long and thin. She wasn't used to me standing firm. As the days turned into a week, the silence from my sister became heavier, more deliberate. No calls. No messages. Just absence. But behind that quiet I sensed movement. She wasn't the type to sit still for long. I double-checked the legal deadlines with my attorney. Everything was in order. She had 30 days. No more, no less. One rainy afternoon I found myself back in the haunted house alone. The boards creaked under my shoes. The air smelled of dust and damp wood. I ran my hand along the wall I'd painted months ago, remembering every late night I'd spent here. This place had been my creation. She tried to turn it into her stage. But now it stood exactly as it began. Mine. The silence inside wasn't empty anymore. It was earned. I stood in the center of the main hallway, the rain tapping gently on the roof, the wooden floor cold beneath my shoes. My fingers brushed the wall I'd painted months earlier, tracing a faint groove where a nail had once held a lantern. For a moment I simply listened. No reporters, no crowds, no sheriff, no sister. Just the house and me finally alone. Then my phone vibrated. The message was brief. Meet me at the lawyer's office tomorrow morning. We need to end this. No apology. No warmth. Just a line that sounded less like a sister and more like a cornered business partner. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked around the house one last time. The walls smelled faintly of sawdust and rain, a scent that always took me back to summer afternoons with a hammer in hand and plans sketched on lined paper. Everything in this house had started with me, and finally it would end with me. The next morning was overcast, the sky a dull sheet of gray. I dressed simply. Black slacks, a white blouse, my brown corduroy jacket, the same one I'd worn to the licensing office months ago. My tote bag hung heavy on my shoulder, the folder inside like a quiet heart beating steadily against my side. Outside the lawyer's office, the sidewalk was slick from last night's rain. She was already there, pacing near the steps, wrapped in a dark wool coat. Her hair was pulled back tightly, makeup perfect as if she were preparing for another performance. But her eyes gave her away, restless, unsettled. When she saw me, her jaw tightened. "You're late." I checked my watch. "I'm on time." "You're just early." She didn't reply. Instead, she turned and walked inside, heels clicking sharply against the tile. The sound echoed down the hallway like a metronome marking the end of a long symphony. We sat in the small conference room, her on one side of the polished oak table, me on the other. Between us sat our lawyer, Mr. Keene, an older man with silver hair and kind but watchful eyes. He greeted us both evenly, as if mediating family business was just another line on his schedule. "Let's get started," he said, opening a leather folder. "We're here to settle the financial and legal matters related to the property and the event." She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I stayed still. Mr. Keene outlined the situation with measured precision. He detailed the ownership documents, the permits, the cease and desist order, and finally the unpaid invoice. As he spoke, I watched her carefully. Each fact landed like a stone dropped into a still pond, small ripples spreading across her carefully controlled expression. When he finished, she laughed lightly, a hollow sound. "This is ridiculous. He's my sister. We can settle this privately. We don't need." "This is private," Mr. Keene interrupted gently. "And this is the settlement." He slid the final document across the table toward her. "A repayment agreement. 30 days. Full amount. Legal acknowledgement of ownership transfer." She stared at it as if the paper might bite. "I can't believe you're doing this to me," she whispered. I met her eyes. "I can." Her lower lip trembled, but she steadied it. "You're ruining our family." I shook my head slowly. "No. I'm just not letting you ruin me anymore." For years I'd been the quiet one. The fixer. The one who smoothed things over after her impulsive decisions. I'd patched roofs, balanced budgets, rewritten plans, all while she smiled for the crowd. Somewhere along the way she'd mistaken my silence for weakness. But silence isn't weakness when it's deliberate. It's power stored up waiting. She picked up the pen, then set it down again. "What happens if I don't sign?" Mr. Keene didn't miss a beat. "Then we proceed to court. And the sheriff's involvement last week will become Exhibit A." Her eyes flicked toward me as if searching for some crack in my resolve. There wasn't one. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, a car horn honked faintly. She swallowed hard, then lifted the pen again. For a moment, her hand hovered above the page, shaking slightly. Then she pressed the tip down and signed. Watching her sign wasn't satisfying in the way I once imagined revenge would be. It wasn't fiery or loud. It was quiet, like a door closing after years of drafty nights. She slid the papers back toward Mr. Keene without meeting my eyes. Her signature looked small beneath the bold legal language, like a footnote on a story she thought she was writing but never truly owned. After the paperwork was finalized, we stood. She hesitated at the doorway, finally turning to me. "You've changed," she said. I held her gaze. "No. I just stopped letting you write my chapters for me." She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time there were no lines left to say. She turned and walked down the hallway, her footsteps fading until there was only silence. Outside, the air smelled of wet concrete and early winter. I stood on the steps of the lawyer's office, watching her car pull away. A light drizzle began, dotting my jacket with tiny dark spots. I didn't move. I let the rain fall, cool and clean, washing away the tension that had lived beneath my skin for too long. That evening I returned to the haunted house. Not as a builder. Not as a sister. Just as myself. The porch light flickered on as I approached, casting a warm glow against the damp boards. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked, the air smelled faintly of paint and wood glue, and somewhere a loose shutter knocked against the siding in the breeze. It wasn't a spectacle anymore. It was mine. I walked through each hallway slowly, touching walls, checking corners, absorbing the quiet. I ended up in the main room where it had all begun, the space that had been transformed into her 12-year tradition. Now stripped of the banners and noise, it felt honest. I set the signed agreement on the table in the center of the room. For a long moment I just looked at it. That piece of paper wasn't just legal ownership. It was every late night, every dismissed idea, Every time I'd been pushed aside. It was proof that being underestimated can be an advantage, if you know how to use it. Margaret stopped by just before sunset, umbrella in hand. He peeked inside smiling. I heard she signed. She did, I said. Margaret stepped into the room, glancing around. Feels different in here now. It does, I agreed. He studied me for a moment. You look lighter. I exhaled, really exhaled for the first time in months. I am. After she left, I lingered inside a while longer. The light outside dimmed to a soft blue, rain tapping against the windows. I thought about the years behind us, childhood pranks, shared rooms, family dinners, and then about the years she'd spent erasing my efforts, reshaping stories to fit her spotlight. Forgiveness didn't come rushing in. Didn't need to. What came instead was clarity. And peace. Before locking up, I picked up the signed papers and slid them into my folder. As I closed the door, I paused for a second on the porch, listening to the rain. It struck the wooden railing like a soft applause. Not for revenge. For closure. I turned the key slowly, hearing the lock click into place. It was a small sound, but it carried weight. Walking down the path toward the street, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The story was no longer hers to tell. It was mine. Fully. Finally. If this story struck a nerve, subscribe for more emotional, revenge-driven stories where quiet women take back what's theirs. New stories every week, and none end the way you expect.